Okay, we are live and recording our first session of the ISBH webinar on cosmology. Our first speaker is Mark Musser. He is the Executive Officer of Ararat Rainier East-West Fellowship. He is a missionary living in Armenia, and he does all sorts of work around the former Soviet Union. He is the author of Nazi Ecology and Wrath or Rest. He has years of experience as a pastor, a missionary, a farmer. He's got work experience with environmental policy, very well versed on this particular topic. So I'm excited to hear him speak. Mark, let her rip.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be able to speak on this topic. It's a very important topic. Right now, the virus is, of course, the main preoccupation of most people, but when you start looking around and start digging around, the main reason why the virus is so important to so many people right now is also getting back to environmentalism, because you've heard about maybe some of the leaders, or world leaders, elites, are trying to reset the economy thanks to this COVID crisis so they can make things more sustainable. So environmentalism is always lurking in the background. It's something to sort of maybe something underneath, people don't pay attention to it. They think it looks good from the surface, and it's something merely political, and they don't realize the depths of what's going on underneath. And, I compare environmentalism to like an undercurrent in a river or a stream, or maybe even an undertow in the state of Washington, where I grew up at, on the ocean, where people, it's dangerous to, in certain places on the Washington beach, to go out in the water, because an undertow can grab you, you don't see it, and it'll take you out 20 miles without even, next thing you know, you're gone. And the same thing with, with undercurrents in rivers and streams. So you can get caught underneath a log, and it'll pull you down and you can't get out. And, this is how I explain as an illustration for environmentalism. Of course, these are natural metaphors, you want to call it that, but also the realities in nature itself. And so there's some vacuum troubles here where things are sucked down into its own vortex. And our society in America has lost many of its freedoms today because of the environmental movement. And the whole, I'll try to explain this and how this all works biblically and what happened even in the Old Testament. And environmentalism is a totalitarian worldview. It's just not some nice thing for hippies, tree huggers and things like this. Those are all false caricatures. It's a very militant movement. It's a dangerous movement. I myself, I grew up, thinking environmentalism was good. I loved John Denver, all of his songs, and grew up as a country boy on a farm, small farm in Olympia, Washington. And the farm I still live on, at least when I'm home. And it's, this is sort of the ideas that people have, but they're very superficial. Probably better to describe myself as a conservationist rather than environmentalist. Environmentalist has lots of extra baggage that's not good. Conservationism really has grown and rooted in a Judeo-Christian worldview closer to my views, but even conservationism has some problems. But we're going to talk about environmentalism, which today is a big movement. It's comprised of many different stripes of people. Most people would describe themselves today as leaning toward environmentalism. If you were to talk to them, they think it's a good thing. So you have the average person, but you have all kinds of big groups. You have rich elites like Ted Turner, and you've got kings and princes like Prince Charles, of course Prince Philip. Many of the monarchs of Europe are all caught up with the environmental movement. And the monarchies of Europe back in the 1800s were caught up in what they used to call conservationism, but again, that's more like Americans had a conservationism, which was actually a better view of how to preserve nature, yet also allow man to be able to do things economically. And so these are all things that are always being discussed. They're always underneath. Much of the cost that we have today, whether it be gas or oil, homes, farms, probably a good half of what you pay at the grocery store or even at the gas station is related to environmental costs. If you buy a home, this is a number of years ago now, 20 years ago, I did a study in the city of Seattle. University of Washington study, of course, the University of Washington is very left, so this is not coming from some right-wing distorted person like myself. Half, as people characterize me, half of the cost of a home today in the state of Washington is wrapped up in environmental regulation. People don't follow the red tape. They don't see it. They don't pay attention to it. But the reason why our world's getting so expensive is because largely the environmental movement. And by the way, poor people in the world, the rest, they can't afford it. So it makes their lives very difficult. And the environmental movement doesn't care. And there's lots of things we could add into that whole discussion. And we'll try to explain some of these things. But today we'll talk about a little bit about the Bible, how God relates to nature, how we are to relate to nature. We'll see some of the problems in the Old Testament, how the nature worshipers actually subverted the Old Testament prophets and the messages which they had, which also upset the kingdom, turned them upside down. We see the same processes have already taken place in our own country, where environmental ethics, rules borrowed from nature and not from the Bible, are now reversing common things that we all take for granted, common blessings. And we'll explain and illustrate this historically, how this also happened in the Old Testament as well. This is nothing new that we see the things happening. So if we were to look at the Bible, when it talks about nature, when it talks about God, when it talks about people, there's a hierarchy. Okay, today environmentalism, they teach that we are to meld with nature, almost like we're to be in communion with nature. This is routinely discussed. This is not biblical. God never commanded any man at any time to commune with nature. But yet this is very common today. Your job, our responsibility, our command is to commune with God. And then we are to rule over nature, not commune with it. That's the command from God. And this command has not been rescinded. This goes back to the book of Genesis. God made the world. He made the world distinct from himself. He made you. Of course, you are part of the created order, but he also made you in his image. And that means that you are above nature. You reflect the image of God. You reflect his person. And he wants you to rule over the world which he has created for not only for himself, but also for you. The world was made for man. And Jesus specifically says that in the Gospels. Of course, it's related to the Sabbath, but the whole idea is related to also the world that we live in. It's all connected, and this goes back to Genesis chapter 1. So if you take a look at Genesis 1, God originally made man in his image. That means something. That means that we are above the world of which that he made for us, and we are not to merge with nature. We are to rule it and subdue it. That's a command from God. God made the world for man to subdue and fill the earth with population. That's what we call the dominion mandate, Genesis chapter 1. So he made Adam and Eve. Of course, we know the story, Genesis chapter 1. God made the world. In 6 days, after each day, he said it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good. And then on the last day, the 6th day, he made man. And then God made a special pronouncement, it's very good. So man is the apex of creation. He is the highlight of creation. He's the best thing that God ever made. And that needs to be respected. Anti-humanism that is so much a part of environmentalism today is against people being made in God's image. And of course, they don't believe in God. So the world is evolutionary, according to evolutionary movements and processes. That's what produced the world that we live in today. So these things are not respected at any time anyway. This is a lot of our problem. We need to respect that creator-creature distinction, but also the fact that that creature is made in God's image, and he has responsibilities that God has given to him. And of course, how do you subdue and fill the earth? Well, if you take a look at chapter 2, God plants a garden, the Garden of Eden. And so basically what God is telling Adam and Eve to do is to subdue and fill the earth. How do you do that? Well, you turn the wilderness into a garden, and the Garden of Eden is the model that you are to use to do that. That was their responsibility. And by the way, remember all of the animals that Adam named in the garden. It's not true that animals need habitat. That's not true. Animals love gardens. They love gardens better than wilderness is a tough place to live, even for animals. And I can tell you, I live on a farm, and the animals love everything that I do. Wild animals too. And I have to keep them out. I have to do what, it's just trouble because, we have things for our cows and things of that nature. I want to grow a garden for myself, for our family to feed. And if I don't put up an 8-foot electric fence, a herd of elk will just eat it all up in no time. They love farms. It's not true that animals need a wilderness habitat. That's really not true. They love farms. In the Garden of Eden, here we have all these animals. Adam is naming them all. They're all happy, but yet Adam could not commune with those animals. Today, this is a real problem because we have sunk so deeply into environmentalism. Most people have better relationships with their animals than they do with each other. This is a huge problem. It's a reflection of a fallen world. It's a reflection of people who have lost their sense of what they are supposed to be doing with regard to their very lives. I was standing at the airport, not too long ago, a couple years ago, and I was just looking at this whole situation, how this is madness. I had a dog that was standing right next to me. Someone brought this dog along, taking a pee right next to me, right next to my foot. This is madness, okay? And our people are sinking into nature, and they have better relationships with their animals than they do with God and with each other. And of course, Adam, when he saw Eve, he got all excited. But then God gave a responsibility. He said, okay, I want you now, you and Adam and Eve, to subdue and fill the earth. So how are you going to do this? There's a lot of work to do. That's a tremendous amount of work. That's especially true in a fallen world. After the fall, it gets worse. It gets difficult. But God has never rescinded the dominion mandate. It still carries through. Psalm 8 is very clear on that. God never rescinded that, what we call the mandate of Genesis. It's our responsibility to subdue and fill. This is what people do. They may not do it in a good way, and we see all the ecological problems connected to it today. I'm not denying that, but it doesn't matter. The fact is, God has still made it a command, and we are to subdue and fill the earth, and that is through marriage, procreation, work, economics, all the things that people hate today. This is exactly what God has told us to do. And so almost anymore, I look at all the movements in the world today, and everything that most people are talking about, I know it's untrue, it's false. Because we live in a fallen world, and God has told us that. And we have fallen minds. We can't put things together. And we need to have God's word to help us understand what is going on around us and the world in which we live in. People aren't doing that today, and so we are sinking into nature. If you don't know who God is, you don't know the scriptures that portray God and declare them to us, where are you going to go? You have no other place to go except to sink down into nature. That's it. There's no other place to go. You go up or down. Where are you going to go? And the Bible says, subdue and fill the earth. You are above nature, and this is your responsibility. So the distinction between nature and history basically was brought out with regard to that dominion mandate. Think about it. Man is not just some natural process that just gets merged with nature. No, he is distinct from nature. And from that, through marriage, through procreation, through children, through the spreading out of those children, through economics, by subduing nature, you create history. And this, of course, is what the Bible is all about. It's a history book. It's a history book about God revealing himself progressively in time to his people. But it's not an evolutionary process. It's something which God does in his own timetable, his own plan, and it's also very concrete and very dogmatic, unlike modern evolutionary theory, which is like a counterfeit to what God has originally designed for us. Of course, the fall of mankind, right? Adam and Eve sinned, and so now we have all these problems. Nature is full of all kinds of troubles now. Nature works against us, thorns and thistles. As soon as you start to dig up the earth, what happens? Thorns and thistles. Now today, basically what's going on, environmentalists are telling don't dig up the earth and don't do those things because you're ruining it. That's partially true. Thorns and thistles it'll produce for you, but you have to live. Okay, the house is going to create ecological problems. Yes, that's true in the fallen world. That is true, but you still have to live. Okay, as soon as you dig up the earth and plant a garden, okay, that upsets the natural balance of that area. Okay, you're going to turn that whole area into weeds. And I can tell you as a farmer, that's exactly what goes on. The weeds just take over, and weeds are not pretty. I hate weeds. I can spot weeds anywhere. I see them right away as a farmer, and I try to get rid of them because all they do is spread like wildfire. So when I drive or when I look around, the first thing all I ever see in most farms is weeds. And you have to weed the garden. You may not like it, but that's what it is. Through sin and death, Satan has dominion now over the earth. He's the prince of power of the air, and through death he controls us. But yet God has never rescinded that dominion mandate. we still have to fulfill it. That's our responsibility. Genesis 4 records what happens afterwards, right? We see the rise of civilization. It didn't take thousands of years. It took very quickly. And they're already against God very quickly. And of course, it was destroyed by the flood. Joshua's conquest, very interesting. That's kind of what the best you can do this side of the grave. Of course, we know a messianic kingdom is coming. Jesus will subdue and fill the earth himself. He will fulfill the Genesis mandate all by himself. Basically, at the second coming of Christ, he will set up the kingdom, and then nature will be revamped. It's going to be restored, resurrected, and there's going to be an unbelievable amount of productivity in the natural world, which is coming at that proper time. Today, we struggle because of our sin, death, and yet we still have to do the things that God has commanded us. But Joshua, of course, the conquest of the promised land, they are going to turn that area that was basically run by the Canaanites. They were nature worshipers. And God was going to allow Israel to take that land because God promised to Abraham 600 years before. God gave the Canaanites 600 years before he allowed them to take it. And then they go in and take it, and their responsibility was to implement the Mosaic Law, which talks about all kinds of things related to economics and ecology. And if they were to do that, God would bless them with rain and with productivity. And that's all discussed with much detail in the book of Deuteronomy, and that's exactly what Joshua, why they entered into the promised land to do it. Israel's failure and then pushed off the fulfillment of the Genesis mandate until the coming of the Messiah. So they were like a little picture of things to come. That's what they were supposed to do, but they couldn't. Why? Because they're fallen. So they didn't do it properly. They're fallen creatures. We are today too. America's fallen. So we had manifest destiny, right, where we subdued and filled the wilderness with Americans. And of course, they came from all over Europe. They came from all over the world because the world was in such dire straits with all kinds of kings and queens ruining everything for everybody. They were controlling people's lives. The economics was backwards, and out of that you get the American Revolution, and people had some real estate they could go to, and they conquered the American West, and now look what's going on today. See, we followed the same type of history that Israel already did. And now environmentalism is taking over. Of course, now we have diseases, this COVID thing, whatever you want to think about it. It's just amazing the things that we see happening around us. And we have a biblical paradigm for all this discussed in great detail in the Old Testament. God uses nature, by the way, to discipline people too. Right? I mean, we know this. We certainly see this throughout the Old Testament. After Adam and Eve sinned, God says, you will die. You will go back to the dust of the earth, as it says. To dust you shall return. Of course, then what did they do? God, in order to cover them, he sacrificed an animal. Okay, you think about that. Animals, nature is sacrificed for the well-being of man. Today, we don't teach that anymore in ecology. That's forbidden, verboten. But that's exactly what we see in the book of Genesis. That's a hard lesson to learn. People don't like it. Cain didn't like it, so he killed Abel over it. Now, you got to think about this kind of stuff. In order for you to live, nature has to be sacrificed. Ultimately, that pictures Jesus dying on the cross for our sins. These animal sacrifices, they were substitutes. Nature is a substitute for your well-being. Many things that we do, houses and buildings and telephone poles, all that, they're not pretty, but they do help people. And we don't like it. I think telephone poles are crosses. And they're ugly, got all these wires, but they certainly provide a lot of blessing, give people power to live. The cross was not a pretty thing to look at. It's a dead tree, but that provides salvation for the human race. See, you have to think about these things biblically. People aren't doing this today. And so they have all kinds of false ideas about environmentalism. They think nature is pure. That's not true. That's a false doctrine. Nature is fallen just like you are. It's the same. If you go to some jungle, okay, that place is full of bacteria. Any person goes out in the wilderness, all by himself, he'll be dead within a week for most people. Because nature is brutal. It's unforgiving, just like the Mosaic Law. It's not your friend. That's why people don't live in the wilderness, most people, because it's very difficult place to live. The sacrifice of nature is introduced as a means of living or survival. It's not pretty. God's teaching us a lesson. The world is fallen. You need a Messiah. That's the point. And people are missing. So it's a lesson from nature every day. But people are not listening to that message today. Again, the dominion mandate is still required of God, but because of sin and death, man cannot properly carry it out. And the history tells us in all kinds of different ways in which man has failed in that process to do that. And usually he winds up worshiping nature rather than what he's supposed to be. He doesn't worship God, and of course then he places himself under nature, which is false, and then once you do that, you're basically a slave to nature. And we see this even in the Old Testament, let alone today. The environmental rules today they're suffocating. People don't pay attention to it, but it's true. And they cost a lot of money. Environmental pollution in the Old Testament was a reflection of false, profane prophesying and its corrupting influences on society. You have verses where it talks about the fish should run out. But the problem wasn't because the Jews were capitalists. The problem was they were sinning against God. That was the problem. The problem was sin. So the environmentalists, they see all these problems out there, but it's because we live in a fallen world. It's not because of capitalism. It's not because of liberty. They want to straighten everybody out by taking away their liberty and by strangulating capitalism. They think that's going to solve the problem. No, it's not. It's going to make it actually worse. See, so the fallen world is something you can't fix. Regulation is not going to fix it. Okay, only the Lord can fix it. That's the whole point. Okay, we live in a fallen world, and Messiah can come back and fix it for us. In the book of Romans, nature is a divine revelation of God that judges the Gentiles, just like the Mosaic law judges Israel for her sins. So nature basically is very unforgiving. You don't live up to what happened with Romans 1. Okay, basically Paul calls them on it. He says, "You guys have turned nature into idolatry." And that's contrary. That's a contradiction of nature. So nature condemns them, just like the Mosaic law. Remember when Joshua and Israel goes into the promised land, and Joshua gives a statement, he gives a speech. He says, I call heaven and earth as witness to you today. That if you don't walk with God, God's going to use basically nature. So nature is a witness of God. It reflects God's person. And the very same God who created the world is also the God who gave them the Mosaic law, which is what the Pentateuch is all about. And you have a direct correlation between what God made and the Mosaic law. If you look at the commandments, they're all rooted in basically nature. First command, don't worship other gods. Okay, why? Because God made it. Don't worship images. Why? Because, again, you are the image of God. You're above nature. Okay, the Sabbath. Keep the Sabbath. Why? Because God made the earth in 6 days. Rested on the Sabbath. He's trying to teach you a 6-day work week. People have it down to 5 now, thanks to Christianity and Jewish people. So you've got even some of the things with family, okay, in the following commands, no adultery, stealing, that's private property that has to be respected, which our governments don't do anymore. Why? Because a lot of them, because of environmental ideas. So these are all things that are anti-biblical, and people are not thinking through what's going on. We live in a fallen world. It's not pretty. And environmental rules are not going to clean up the planet. Anybody who thinks that, he's foolish. You have to learn to think hard. You have to learn to think biblically about things. The book of Revelation, the destruction of nature, is used to judge the great evils of apocalyptic mankind. Global warming is coming, but it's not what the environmentalists are talking about. It's going to be a lot worse. And it's going to be the judgment of God against their sin, not against capitalism per se. Tyranny, nature worship is very common in the Bible. Babylonian nature worship basically was spread throughout the entire earth after the Tower of Babel. And of course, Israel got caught up in this too. Elisha, they lived in very difficult times under the powers of all kinds of different issues. But, Baal worship, worshiping Baal. He was a god of thunder, the god of global warming. And so all this stuff has been talked about before, all in the past. Baal was the storm of fertility god, worshipped by the Canaanites, which mushroomed in the days of Elijah. And Elijah had to run away in the cave. Why? Because of the persecution, because of totalitarian ideas that were connected to that nature worship. Along with this, on the one hand, you have this totalitarianism, like Jezebel, worshiping nature, Ahab, By the way, Ahab took private property from, remember, the vineyard. Remember that whole discussion. He took it away from Nabal, but not Nabal, that's in David's time. Anyway, I can't think of the name, forgive me. But he stole a piece of property. So, and then they have all these ascetic practices, which they did. Remember, they were cutting themselves, the Baal prophets, in order to get Baal to do something for them. Then on the other hand, we have all this sexual license on the other hand. And then on the other hand, they're killing kids, child sacrifice. Okay, what are we doing today? What is Hollywood giving to us? And it's the same thing. Is it any better? We have sexual madness. We have asceticism. They make you feel guilty for driving your car or turning on the light. But you can have sex with anything that moves. And then, of course, abortion. This stuff is all the same. This is nothing new under the sun, as Solomon tells us. Thanks to Jezebel's Baalistic despotic influences, Ahab stole Naboth's, there it is right there, his vineyard from him and had him murdered, killed him. Isaiah speaks of Israel's lack of spiritual leadership while the nation worshipped trees and mountains and offered child sacrifices to Baal. It's all discussed in great detail in the book of Isaiah. And it's why the book of Isaiah is such an incredible book of judgment, because that's what people were doing. This is why the Assyrians came in and just really did a number on them. Basically choked out all of Israel, destroyed everything that Israel had up until Jerusalem, right up to the very neck, as it says in Revelation, or in Isaiah chapter 7 and 8. God delivered them. They had a good king, but again, people were disciplined by God because of all the nature worship they were practicing. Jeremiah, the same thing. Later on, a couple hundred years later, the same problems. They were still worshiping Baal. Instincts. That's where most people are. It's just brute instincts. That's all most people are in America today. They're not thinking at all. There is no thinking today. The mind is gone. You watch what's going on in our home right now in America, the anarchy, the lawlessness, the foolishness, the madness. People have lost their minds over this virus, and we're in deep trouble. A lot of this is because of what happened also with regard to the nature worship that preceded all this. People can't think anymore because they're just pieces of nature. And evolution is just something which has come along and we just happen to be here. Now, these are all false ideas. And the same types of things were going on in Jeremiah's day and Isaiah's day. Of course, the Babylonian exile. Today, there's a lot of lawlessness in our society, but environmentalism actually produces that lawlessness. And interesting, they blame Jews and Christians for separating man from nature. This is one of the primary targets that environmentalists have. It's why they're not happy with Jews and with Christians. Environmentalism is a totalitarian movement because its emphasis upon a mutual interdependence designed to save the planet through all-encompassing holistic solutions. That's what they want to do. And they pass laws and all kinds of rules and regulations to save everybody. And of course, it doesn't work. It's a form of legalism. Salvation by law. Legalism is a false doctrine. I don't care what it is. If it's environmentalism, if it's politics, okay, whatever it may be, if it's religion, laws don't, you cannot save people by law because people are fallen creatures. This has already been tried. Israel had 1,400 years of trying to save themselves by law, and they couldn't do it. And they spent up a half the time worshiping Baal. And then God gave them divine discipline severely at times because of what they did. Modern environmentalism promotes lawlessness through its holistic nature-based ethos that reduces people down to the brute realm of nature. So you're just a part of a piece of nature that is not made in God's image. Where's your ethics going to come from? Okay, well, that which is latest, supposedly. So now today, ethics, look at what's going on today in our society. There is no ethics. They call it social justice, but it's exactly the opposite. You have to look at things biblically. People aren't doing that. They're also very apocalyptic. The global warming apocalypse, that's a false apocalypse. One of the things that they criticize Christians and Jews for is that they are anthropocentric. That means they're man-centered. Well, yes, we're made in God's image. That's the whole point. And humanism, by the way, comes out of Judeo-Christian worldview. It's a distorted picture of man, but still humanism comes out of Judeo-Christianity. You don't have humanism in the Eastern cults, in the Eastern mysticism, but you do in the West. Why? Because they secularized the book of Genesis, where man is made in God's image, man's important. God made the world for man. So they distorted that. And humanism, of course, created some ecological problems, didn't it? But that's all, again, distortion of God's original plan. A medieval scholar, environmentalist Lynn White Jr. complained in 1967, especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world's ever seen. So Christianity hates nature and loves man. That's sort of the argument. I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but that's sort of the emphasis of what they're trying to say. Notice the difference here. If you take a look at this, the hierarchy of God they reject, they want everybody to be equal. That's part of the environmental social justice today. And I can tell you right now, in the circle of life, there's no thinking going on today. Not at all. That's a false picture, but that's what they're teaching this to kids all the time in our schools. The circle of life. Remember, not John Lennon. John Lennon taught it too, but the song that John, what's his name? John. Circle of life. Elton John. There you are on the other side. Of course, notice here, they portray it this way. We don't want that Judeo-Christian where man is at the center of all things. That's what God wants. Of course, God is at the center too, but he's made you in his image, so in the natural world, you should be the center of all things. You're in charge. But in the environmental ethos, notice the difference. You're just a part of nature. You have no more rights than the chimpanzee or the shark or the elk standing right next to you. They all have the same rights that you do. We need to write up a Declaration of Independence for the animals too. That's what they're doing. They've already done this. And they're going to replace our Declaration of Independence of freedom and liberty for giving all kinds of rights to animals who are not made in God's image. This stuff is happening. It's happening all the time. And people aren't aware of that. But this is where environmentalism headed, and they will take away everything that you have. And they're going to give it back to the animals. Very interesting. Part of the judgment of God, just like Baal, just like the Old Testament. Notice the ego. If you believe, like Jews and Christians, that's that egocentric. Well, humanism was, but that's a distortion of God's plan. Notice the eco. Again, everything's in that circle of life where everything is good. And with the circle of life, we get the animals and give them rights, and then we're going to have a green planet again. But with the ego, we have Jews and Christians. They've given us this false humanism. All it does is lead to ecological problems. No, that's really not true. What's led to the ecological problems is the world is fallen. And God is trying to teach you, in order to live, we have to sacrifice nature. And a lot of that pollution comes out of that. Okay, you have to eat, and then as soon as you eat, it goes to this tummy and it goes out the back end, right? Okay, that's pollution. Bacteria is a huge. The environmentalists are very concerned about bacteria, especially your bacteria. They have all kinds of rules regulating that. Okay, we live in a fallen world. We're fallen bodies, fallen creatures. The food that we eat is made from the dust of the earth, which God specifically cursed. He cursed the ground from which plants are made. So the idea of getting back to green plants that are clean, so I don't eat all this, the so-called what they talk capitalistic farming and all the factory farming that's not clean. Look at the things you take out of the garden are just as dirty. They're no better. God cursed the ground. It's not true. If I get back to nature, get back to organic, then I'm going to have a clean body. That's not true. That's a false doctrine. It's a false teaching. But our world's wrapped up in it today. It's amazing. It's because they can't think biblically. They're sinking down to nature, and nature is now their guide, and now they can't do things as they should. So, Paul, I'm not exactly sure where I'm at on time here. The computer hides my clock here. I got a phone. So let me see. What have I got here? Okay, I've still got a few minutes.
Okay.
Great. So here's some things to think about here with regard to biblical ethics versus environmentalism. And I'll sum this up in about 5-10 minutes here. But you think about when Joshua entered into the promised land. Freedom under the rule of law is assumed in the Old Testament. See, what's going to happen? God's going to give Israel, as they go into the promised land, freedom. They get their property. In Egypt, they're worshiping the sun. They're worshiping Pharaoh. Pharaoh told them to make bricks without straw. Okay, our governments do this kind of stuff to us all the time, especially on the environmental. They're telling basically to reproduce all kinds of power with windmills and with solar panels. And we're going to tear down the dams. We're going to tear down the electricity, and it's like making bricks without straw. It's the same kind of stuff. So God delivered them out of that, at the house of slavery, the iron furnace, as it was called. Not a nice place. What are they doing in Egypt? They're worshiping nature. They're worshiping Pharaoh. They're worshiping all the gods of nature. And life was miserable. So God delivered them out of that and then gave them the promised land. And then each farmer, each house, each family was to be given a piece of real estate so they would not be slaves to Pharaoh. They were given freedom. However, it was under the rule of the Mosaic law. So freedom and the rule of law, where does that go back to? It goes back to the promised land of Israel. Worship God. Man is made in God's image. He is to cultivate the land which God has given him. That land was privately given, private property. That was to be respected. And then God will bless you if you obey God and the Mosaic law so that you can have an ecology, an environment which is good. This is what the Bible teaches over and over and over again. It's not something that is, unusual. It's the common theme throughout the Old Testament especially. In ancient Israel, the natural world was to be farmed and mined for human development. Let me read some verses here. And then I think, I'm not sure, maybe have a few more minutes, but this is quite a passage of Scripture, and this is exactly the opposite of what we're being told today. Notice it says here, chapter 8, of course, God brought Israel in Deuteronomy. He brought them out of Egypt, and he says here, I brought you through the wilderness, which was not a good place. God had to take care of them specifically in the wilderness. He had to give them miracles to live because the wilderness out in the desert, especially the Sinai desert, is bad. It's hot, there's nothing to eat. So God took care of them for 40 years. He also disciplined them severely because of their unbelief. So now they go into the promised land. And notice what he says here, verse 5. Thus you are to know in your heart that the Lord your God was disciplining you just as a man disciplines his son. Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God to walk in his ways and to fear him. So they are to go into the promised land. For the Lord your God is bringing you to a good land. Okay, what are you going to do with that land? Well, he tells us, a land of brooks of water. Who's that for? It's for people. Okay, today, the environmentalists tell us that the water belongs to the state. Well, who is the state? Well, the state belongs to the people. But no, they give it to the abstract state, and then you can't have it. That's how they do it today. They take it away from you. And then they say, oh, there's no water. And they've regulated that. Just let you know, this is what goes on in the average American environmental groups today. He says here, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing forth in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. So you are to build farms with that land. Do you realize the environmental movement hates farmers more than anything else? Do you want to know why? It's because farmers change the landscape more than any other group of people. They take the wilderness and turn it into a farm. And we're talking huge and vast tracts of land to do that. They don't like that. The cities have their place. They're small, comparatively speaking. But a farmer, he takes vast acreages and turns the wilderness into a garden. They're trying to stop that. Okay, if you take away the farms, how are you going to live? How are you going to feed those people in the city? Well, they don't really care because they think there's too many people. Notice, keep reading. A land where you will eat food without scarcity, in which you will not lack anything. A land whose stones are iron, and out of the hills so you can dig copper. Mining is okay. God said it's okay to mine. Okay, now anymore, they will not even allow you to mine anymore because all they do is talk about the ecological problems. It's like the virus. That's all they talk about. The virus. And then people get brainwashed with this stuff. It's the same with environmentalism. They think it's evil. So then they stop doing it. Well, how are you going to make money? And then, of course, the world is in poverty. And of course, the environmentalist comes in, takes away the right to do anything, and it just continues the poverty. Okay, these verses are being ignored today. This is why the world is in such deep trouble economically. Okay, the debts of the world are vast. They're huge. They're astronomical. Because these things are being ignored. And then God warns them, be worried that you forget about me. So again, the Mosaic Law talked about all these things. We see the opposition between what God commanded and what God has made and what the nature worshipers do in the Old Testament. The same is true today. These things have not gone away. It's the same type of processes. And just sort of give you like a little taste of the Bible versus environmentalism today. So anyway, I think we are done. We're out of time. There's many things we could talk about. Any questions at all that people may have, I don't know. I don't know who's all been listening, but hopefully it's been helpful. And thank you all for having me up here.
Thank you very much, Mark. I really appreciate you. Let's see.
You're welcome.
Got a question. During your talk, you used the term creator-creature distinction. That's an interesting term. Could you clarify what exactly that means and how it contrasts perhaps to the concept of the continuity of being?
Right, yeah. Well, that's what environmentalism is against, the creator-creature distinction. They want to put everybody underneath a oneness. You know, everything is all one. So there is no distinction between God and nature and man. So it's all part of the same continuity of being, as you would call it. They're all part of the circle of life. But in the Bible, God has a creator-creature distinction. And then you're made in God's image, so that you're actually distinct and you're above nature. So those things in the Bible have to be respected. And first of all, God is not a part of nature. You don't worship God as nature, or you don't worship nature as God in any sense of either way. And God needs to be respected as the true God, the creator. And so he's distinct from nature. He is the one who made it. Of course, we're creatures and we worship God because of what he has made. So we are distinct. And then God made us distinct from nature to rule over the world in which we live in.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. Now you've talked about the environmentalist agenda behind the National Socialist movement, and this is the big thrust of your book on Nazi ecology. Very interesting topic. The National Socialist experiment is something that needs to be studied. So many people are trying to forget it, wipe out memory of the Holocaust. That's nonsense. This is something that needs to be taught in schools left and right. But growing up, hearing about this Nazi movement, I never heard anything talked about the environmentalist agenda behind it until I met you. What are some of the basic, most evident evidences that we have that the Nazi movement was indeed an environmentalist movement?
Well, it's better to characterize National Socialism as a worship of nature. And if you look carefully at what they were doing, it's like an ancient fertility cult brought up to date. Mm-hmm. So with Baalism, of course, they're basically what's happening in ancient Baalism in the Old Testament. They are sacrificing children for the sake of natural fertility. See, so and of course they're also having sex underneath the trees, and Baal is going to mystically help them have fertile gardens and everything else. So in the old days, under Baalism, in order to have a fertile garden, you didn't put fertilizer on it. You had sex with the cult prostitutes, and then you sacrificed your kids.
Well, that's logical.
That's fertilizing things Baal style. Of course, but that's what they did because, and of course, it's foolishness, and we understand all that. But this is what happens when people ignore God. Now, with the Nazis, basically, they're going to bring it up to date. And their eugenics is basically a fertility cult. And they're into population control. Okay, they wanted to control population. They believed Germany was too populated, and that they were going to head east into Ukraine and Belarus and turn those into basically a garden park of sustainable development for Germans. And they were going to, of course, kill the Jews. And they used environmental part of the discussion with the Jews. They used environmental terminology to describe the Jews as unnatural. Mm-hmm. It goes back to Genesis 1. They're not made. The Jew is different. He's made in God's image, and so the Nazis denied all that. You're just a piece of nature. And of course, with regard to helping people, they didn't. The Nazis said that breeds softness. You need to be hard like nature. If you listen to Jews and Christians, we are to take care of each other, and they believe what that does is make us all weak in the blood. We get all these diseases because we're taking care of people that nature normally would just get rid of. See, so their eugenics program was population control, nature fertility type of discussion, and they wanted to help clean up the cities. The cities were dirty, run by international Jews and their finances. That, you know, the Jews don't have any ideas of parks and things like that. All they do is run dirty cities, so we're going to put them in the ghettos like a form of environmental social justice along with that.
Isn't that so self-contradictory? I mean, they
Yeah.
try to equate animals and humans, and then to dehumanize a group
Yes.
of people, they equate them with pigs and animals. Well, wait a minute. I thought pigs and animals were equal with us. And
That's what they did.
So
but
blind, so blind.
in one sense, it's not contradictory because invariably at the end of the day, if you worship nature, you will invariably worship man because man, regardless, is the highest creature there is. You have no way. So the Führer shows up to and you worship him, see. And so even with Babylon, Babylonia, you know, you had Nebuchadnezzar, of course, the Tower of Babel, you know, they worshipped, of course, Nimrod was a great hunter, you know. So you have all these things where, yeah, we worship nature, but at the end of the day, you wind up worshiping human beings, strangely enough. So, but it's all contradictory, but in a fallen world, that's normal.
Isn't it interesting that here in Ukraine, every now and then there will be a discovery of a mass grave, and they're always plowed over, buried, incinerate the bodies. Of course, we have Babin Yar just down the road, the ravines where they just plowed over the mass murders. It's such an environmentalist way.
Nazi racism was rooted in ecology. See, the biology, ecology is part of the same root. You know, the same man who basically developed what we call social Darwinism. His name was Ernst Haeckel. He's also the man who coined the term ecology. So basically what you have going on in the 1800s in Germany was a racist form of environmentalism, biology and ecology together, in a monistic one, all together. Okay, that all blew up in World War II and led to the destruction of millions of people. After the war, the same eugenicists started talking about overpopulation in general. So today we have environmentalism and anti-humanism in general. So it's no longer racist, but they do talk about indigenous type of discussions. People need to be indigenous to their own environment. That's a form of the same racism that they were all talking about in the 1800s. So when I look at multiculturalism, I think of multi-racism, multi-tribalism, multi-indigenous-ism. So that's kind of what they replace it with. It's no longer the Aryan man. It's now the indigenous man against Judeo-Christian universal values that we see today in our modern environmental movement, anti-humanistic, anti-humanism. It's part of the same stuff. It's just an evolved form of the same stuff, and people are, they don't think about it seriously, so they can't see it through. They can't think it through.
That's another irony of the whole thing. In the modern context, the word Nazi is thrown around as an insult. And it's usually people who hold to the same 19th century ideology that produced National Socialism.
Yes, it's still with us.
Accusing that.
It's still with us big time. So you have philosophical movements, the 1800s, that undergirded National Socialism was Romanticism, for one thing. Romance with nature. Nature is king, and literally speaking, he's your master. Then you have existentialism, which worshipped basically existence itself against human beings. Then you have also the evolutionary sciences, where man is no longer above nature; he's a part of it. Then you have idealism as well, going back to Kant. That's all wrapped up into a very dangerous concoction that blew up all of Europe in World War II. And the same strands of all that same discussion is still with us even today.
Now we have a sister here on Facebook that mentioned the current trend of veganism. Would you say that some of this environmentalism is feeding into the veganist movement? I mean, I think vegan, I think just happy people eating vegetables, but is there something a little bit deeper driving perhaps some of the?
Well, you know, if you, as you know, I don't get into, if people want to eat vegetables only as their own preference, you know, that's fine. I mean, I don't have that. They're free to do that. When you start requiring other people to do that, then it's a problem. Okay, then that's legalism. Then you're requiring other people to do things that are against their personal conscience per se. Potentially from the Bible, God says in Genesis chapter 9 that after the flood, you're allowed to eat meat. In fact, God almost commands it. You know, that you can't eat the blood, but you can eat meat. So vegetarianism was actually practiced before the flood, but after the flood, this earth that we live on was not nearly as beautiful, it's not nearly as plentiful, and so God, now we eat animals along with them. Of course, this is going to portray animal sacrifice, and of course also Jesus on the cross. We have to depend upon his flesh in order to live our eternal life. Of course, he's speaking figuratively, the book of John. Paul talks of, he warns, interesting, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, a very interesting passage where he says, the day will come in the later times when men will forbid marriage and the eating of meat. Now, you may have foods in the passage, which is too general, but they're talking about meats. So they're going to, and the environmentalists are all today against eating meat because they think that cows are polluting, they pollute the atmosphere with their gas and, of course, the bacteria. They eat all this grass, and you have to have huge grass farms for cows, and that ruins the landscape. And so they're against cows. And the Nazis, by the way, many of the leading Nazis were almost all vegetarians. Hitler was a vegetarian. Goebbels was a vegetarian. Himmler was a vegetarian. Yeah, of course, Goering was not. He was a hunter, but he was a spiritual hunter. But you know, especially Rudolf Hess. He was the biggest vegetarian of them all. And after the war, the German plan was to require all Germans to become vegetarians. Hitler had he believed that in the future his own dog would become a vegetarian. I mean, you know, that he believed that the natural progress of evolution was leading toward vegetarianism. So he actually taught that, and he said that at some point in the future, dogs are going to become vegetarian, and he was feeding his own dogs vegetarian food back then. And today, you go to the store today in America, most of the dog food you buy is full of vegetables for dogs today.
Very interesting.
Anyway, it's a big discussion, you know, but I'm not against people if they want to eat vegetables only. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But if you require me to do it, then that's a different problem. You know, that's I like what I like too, and I for what I do too. So, but yes, vegetarianism can be very dangerous.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this with us. Thank you for kicking off our webinar.
Okay, great.
This concludes our first session, and we'll have the next one on the Rakia of Genesis here in a few minutes. So thank you so much, Mark. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. Catch you later.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Paul.